So, today we are diving deep into one of the most savage and politically charged executions in all of history. Seriously, this was a death designed not just to kill a man, but to completely erase his memory and to terrorize an entire nation. This is the story of the final brutal hours of William Wallace. I want you to just picture this for a second. It's August 23rd, 1305. London is just buzzing, but it's not a happy buzz. It's a kind of bloodthirsty excitement. You got merchants leaving their shops, nobles coming down from their mansions, all of them pouring into the streets for one reason: to watch a man die in the most gruesome way they could possibly imagine. And there he is. He's being dragged, naked, behind a horse, his body already just a raw, bloody mess from the journey south. Every single stone on the road from Scotland left its mark on him. But here's the thing. Even as the crowd is spitting on him, throwing garbage, they say his eyes were still burning with defiance. Now, a spectacle like this level of suffering, it doesn't just happen by accident. It was the climax of years of brutal war, of rebellion, and of one king's absolute obsession with revenge. So the question is, how did the man who became the guardian of Scotland end up here, completely at the mercy of his most hated enemy? To really understand the end of this story, we have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of Wallace's life, but the beginning of the crisis that absolutely tore his country apart. It was a series of just awful tragedies that threw a once peaceful Scotland into a desperate fight for its very survival.
And everything fell apart with just shocking speed. In less than a single decade, Scotland goes from being stable and pretty prosperous to being kingless and totally vulnerable. And this chaos, it gave England's ruthless king, Edward I, you might know him as Edward Longshanks, the perfect excuse to step in and assert his power, which all led to a horrifyingly brutal invasion.
The very first city to feel King Edward's wrath was a place called Berwick. And the English army, they didn't just defeat the soldiers there, they slaughtered everyone. I mean, the chronicles from that time talk about rivers literally running red with blood. An estimated 17,000 people, men, women, and children, were butchered. This was pure terror, designed to break the Scottish will to even think about resisting.
But it had the exact opposite effect. While all the Scottish nobles were bending the knee to their new conqueror, a young man from the lower nobility, William Wallace, was watching in disgust. This guy was a giant for his time, almost 6.5 feet tall, and his willpower was like steel. There was no way he was going to accept this. And so, right out of the ashes of Berwick, a rebellion starts to catch fire. And Wallace, he wasn't just some big tough guy. He had a brilliant mind for tactics and this unshakable belief in freedom. It didn't take long for him to become the leader of this growing resistance, the living symbol of Scottish defiance. All of that defiance came to a head at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. And let's be honest, the odds were just impossible. A small Scottish force, mostly on foot, against the full power of the English army, which included the best heavy cavalry in all of Europe. The English commanders were so cocky, they basically treated it like a day at the park. But Wallace got something they didn't. Timing is absolutely everything. He waited patiently as the huge English army started to funnel itself across that tiny, narrow bridge. And at the exact moment that half of them were across, he unleashed hell. The Scots just poured down from the high ground, turning that bridge into a death trap and completely wiping out the divided English force. It was a stunning, almost unbelievable victory, and it transformed Wallace overnight from a wanted outlaw into a national hero. He was now the de facto ruler of the entire kingdom. For one brief, shining moment, it really looked like David had actually slain Goliath. But as you can imagine, King Edward Longshanks was not a man who took humiliation well. He completely abandoned his wars in France, he called back his best knights, and he put together a massive army with one single, ruthless goal: the total and utter destruction of William Wallace. At the next major battle, the Battle of Falkirk, Edward proved he'd learned his lesson. Wallace set up his spearmen in these defensive circles called schiltrons. Think of them like giant, angry hedgehogs made of pikes. Absolutely impossible for cavalry to charge. But they were sitting ducks for Edward's secret weapon, Welsh longbowmen. They just unleashed a storm of armor-piercing arrows from a safe distance, and it just tore the Scottish ranks to shreds. Falkirk was a total massacre. Wallace barely got out of there with his life. He was forced to resign as guardian, and then he was abandoned by the Scottish nobles, who suddenly saw him as a liability. He became a fugitive. For years, he was like a ghost, hunted all across Scotland, and some people say even to France and Rome, always trying to get support for his cause.
The end finally came in 1305, and it wasn't in some blaze of glory on a battlefield, it was through betrayal. A Scottish knight, a guy named John de Menteith, lured Wallace into a trap. He was captured, put in chains, and then began the long drag to London to face the king's terrible, terrible vengeance.
The trial they held for him at Westminster Hall was a complete sham. It was just political theater. I mean, the charges themselves were ridiculous. How could he possibly be guilty of treason against a king he'd never sworn loyalty to? The men he killed were soldiers in an invading army, and the robbery they talked about, that was funding a war for liberation. When they finally gave him a chance to speak, Wallace delivered this incredible, defiant line. He said, "I cannot be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject. He owed King Edward nothing. He was not his king." And those words, spoken right in the heart of English power, well, they sealed a fate that was pretty much already decided.
So the sentence was this: to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. This was the absolute peak of judicial cruelty, saved only for the worst of the worst traitors. And you have to understand, this wasn't just about killing someone. It was about publicly destroying them, their body, their memory, in the most agonizing way you can think of. The whole process was a methodical performance of pure suffering. First, dragged through the streets, which just tore his flesh to ribbons. Then, hanged until he was nearly dead, but they cut him down so he was still alive. And then, while he was still conscious, he was disemboweled, his organs burned right in front of his eyes, and he was castrated. Only then, after all of that, was he finally beheaded and his body chopped into 4 pieces. And this final act of desecration, this was the king's real message. Wallace's head was preserved in tar and stuck on a spike on London Bridge. His 4 limbs were sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, a gruesome warning to any other Scot who even dared to dream of freedom. In his mind, Edward Longshanks had won. He had completely obliterated his enemy. Surely, no one would ever risk a fate like that again. But here's something tyrants never seem to understand: the incredible power of martyrdom. The king's ultimate act of terror was about to backfire in the most spectacular way.
The effect was immediate, and it was profound. Within just months of Wallace's execution, Robert the Bruce steps up, seizes the crown, and the war is back on. At the huge, decisive Battle of Bannockburn, Scottish soldiers would literally scream Wallace's name as a war cry. His death didn't end the rebellion, it made it immortal.
And that, right there, is the ultimate irony of this whole story. The very spectacle that was designed to crush the spirit of Scottish resistance instead became its most powerful fuel. The king tried to make an example of one man, but instead he made him a legend, a symbol for a cause that was so much bigger than himself. In the end, Wallace's real victory wasn't on the battlefield. It was in inspiring an entire nation. This famous line from the Declaration of Arbroath, which is basically Scotland's Declaration of Independence, it perfectly captures the spirit that Wallace embodied. He might not have lived to see a free Scotland, but his unbelievable sacrifice laid its very foundation. He became immortal,